The cold air of the autumn forest pressed in around the stray dog as she padded forward, her lean body tensed with hunger and fatigue. The ground was a damp carpet of fallen leaves, their brittle edges whispering under her tired paws. Her breath came in quiet puffs, visible in the crisp evening air. She sniffed at the earth, searching for anything edible, roots, insects, the remnants of something another creature had left behind, but the forest was growing barren as the season crept toward winter. She cast a glance behind her. The small, shivering form of her pup followed a few steps behind, his steps faltering. He was slower than before, his legs weak, his eyes heavy-lidded. Once, he would have bounced through the undergrowth, his tiny tail wagging, eager to chase the crickets that sprang from the grass. Now, he struggled to keep up. The mother dog had noticed the changes creeping over him. The way he ate less, the way his ribs became more visible beneath his patchy fur. She had tried everything. She had given him the scraps of food she found, had let him drink before her when they came across stagnant puddles, had curled around him at night to keep him warm. But none of it seemed to be enough. He was slipping away from her, and she didn't know how to stop it. Tonight she felt the urgency more than ever. The scent of frost clung to the wind, and the sky was a dark sheet above the trees, promising another night of bitter cold. The pup would not last long if he grew any weaker. A tightness coiled in her chest at the thought, an instinctual fear she could not name. Her ears twitched, alert to the sounds of the forest. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance. The rustle of unseen creatures scurrying through the leaves sent small tremors through her exhausted limbs. She knew she had to keep moving, keep searching. The pup whimpered. The sound was soft, almost inaudible, but to her, it was the loudest thing in the world. She turned sharply, her eyes searching his frail form. He had stopped walking, his legs trembling, his small frame swaying. His head dipped slightly, his ears drooping. A sharp pang of helplessness lanced through her. She trotted back to him and nudged his cheek with her nose, urging him forward. He lifted his head, his cloudy eyes meeting hers for a moment before lowering again. He tried to take a step, but his paws barely lifted off the ground before giving out beneath him. She licked his face, a desperate attempt to reassure him, to tell him that she was there. But he only whined in response. The mother dog swallowed the whimper that threatened to rise in her own throat. She lowered herself beside him, pressing her body against his, hoping her warmth would seep into his fragile form. For a long moment, she simply lay there, listening to the faint rhythm of his breathing. She could feel the shallow rise and fall of his ribs, the delicate way his heartbeat stuttered against her. He was too cold, too weak. She lifted her head, her eyes scanning the forest for something, anything. But the trees stood silent, indifferent to the quiet battle taking place beneath them. The world around her did not care about her struggle, about her pup's failing strength. The air grew colder. The night crept in. She curled around him tightly, shielding him as best as she could from the biting wind. But she knew, deep inside her, that this was not enough. Time was running out. The frost came like an ambush, sudden and merciless. One day, the forest was a brittle, dying thing, covered in fallen leaves and damp earth. The next, it was an endless stretch of white, the ground hardened into an unforgiving sheet of ice. The trees stood frozen, their skeletal branches weighed down by thick layers of frost. Everything was silent, deadened by the cold. The mother dog pressed forward, each step in agony as the snow swallowed her paws, numbing them to the bone. Her breath came in harsh gasps, curling in the air like pale ghosts. She had known hunger before, had spent endless days scavenging, fighting off starvation with scraps and instinct, but this was different. This was worse. Food had been scarce before. Now it was non-existent. Then the pup. He was barely moving now. He trailed behind her, his tiny paws sinking into the deepening snow, his frail body shivering violently. His fur, once patchy and thin, was now dusted with frost, clinging to him like death itself. Every step he took seemed to cost him more than he had left to give. More than once, he collapsed, his legs folding beneath him, his breath shallow. Each time, the mother would turn back, nudge him desperately, try to will him forward. She would lick his face, her nose cold against his frozen fur, whimper softly to him, anything to keep him awake, to keep him moving. But he was slipping. She could feel it. The mother dog curled around him whenever he collapsed, pressing herself against his tiny body, trying to force warmth into him. But the cold was relentless. It crept into her, numbing her limbs, stealing her strength. Her ribs ached with hunger, her muscles screamed with exhaustion, but none of it compared to the fear twisting in her gut. He was too weak. He wasn't eating. He wasn't growing. She couldn't protect him from this. She couldn't fight the cold. Night came swiftly, the sky turning into an endless abyss above them. The temperature plummeted further, and the snow thickened, falling in sharp, biting flakes. The mother dog found a place beneath the tangled roots of a fallen tree, a small hollow where the wind couldn't reach them as viciously. She lay down, pulling the pup close, curling around him with what little warmth she had left. His breathing was faint, barely there. She nosed at him, nudged his tiny ribs, but he only whimpered weakly in response. She let out a low, grieving whine, pressing her face against his. This couldn't be the end. This couldn't be how it ended. She had fought too hard. She had starved, bled, searched, struggled. But the world didn't care about her fight. The world didn't care about the starving mother trying to keep her only pup alive. The forest, the snow, the cold, it had all turned against them, silent and indifferent. Her body was shaking now, from cold or exhaustion, she didn't know. She just knew that time was running out. And she was powerless to stop it. The mother dog lay curled around her pup, her body stiff and barely warm, her breath weak in the freezing night. Snow piled around them, filling the small hollow under the tree roots, threatening to bury them alive. The pup had stopped shivering. He barely moved, barely breathed. A thin layer of frost clung to his muzzle, his tiny ribs no longer rising and falling with the same weak tremors. The mother pressed her nose to his side, desperate, nudging him with all the strength she had left. But he was limp. Too limp. She let out a low, broken whimper, the sound swallowed instantly by the icy air. Something. A scent. She lifted her head, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. The bitter cold dulled her senses, but the smell was undeniable. Would smoke. A human fire. She turned her head, her tired eyes searching through the darkness. And then she saw it, a glow, faint and flickering, far in the distance. A house. Humans. Fear tightened in her chest. Humans meant danger. She had learned that long ago. She still carried the scars of that lesson, the deep gash near her hind leg from a thrown rock, the dull ache in her ribs from the kick of a heavy boot. Humans hurt. Humans chased. Humans shouted. She had stayed away from them for so long, lurking in the shadows of the forest, living on scraps and instinct. But her pup, she looked down at him. He was dying. Right there in her arms, he was slipping away, and she could do nothing to stop it. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to run, to hide in the depths of the forest where humans couldn't reach them. But she knew, if she stayed, he wouldn't see another sunrise. So she made her choice. Ignoring the pain in her limbs, the hunger clawing at her stomach, she bent down and carefully took the pup's tiny, frozen body in her jaws. He was too light, too still. The weight of him filled her with dread, but she didn't stop. She forced her legs to move, lifting him off the icy ground, carrying him toward the distant glow. Each step was agony. The snow was deep, swallowing her paws, dragging at her weak frame. The cold cut through her like knives, her fur stiff with frost. Her legs trembled beneath her, exhaustion pressing down like an unbearable weight. But she didn't stop. The lights grew closer. She pushed forward, her heart pounding, every instinct inside her screaming that this was wrong, that she was walking into danger. The scent of humans thickened in the air, mingling with the smoke and the warm scent of food. It made her stomach twist painfully with hunger, but she ignored it. She reached the edge of the trees, her paws sinking into the untouched snow near the house. She hesitated, ears flicking back, eyes darting over the structure. A cabin. A chimney with smoke curling into the dark sky. A warm glow spilling from a window. She took another step forward. The snow crunched beneath her. and then blinding. A sudden flood of brightness spilled over her, searing into her tired eyes. A door had opened. A figure stood in the doorway, a towering shape against the night. The mother froze, her body coiled with fear, every muscle screaming at her to turn and run. But the pup in her jaws let out the weakest, faintest whimper. And she didn't move. The mother dog stood motionless, her thin body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Snow clung to her fur, ice crusting over her aching paws. She had never been this close to a human dwelling before, never dared to step so far out of the shadows. But here she was, standing on the wooden doorstep, the rough boards biting into her frozen pads. She gently placed her pup down. The little body barely stirred. His fur was damp with melting frost, his breathing so shallow it was almost impossible to see. She nudged him once, licking his tiny head, but he didn't react. Panic twisted inside her. He was still alive. He had to be. Inside the house, footsteps creaked across the wooden floor. John Anderson, a healer who had long lived on the edge of the forest, stirred from his chair. He had been reading by the fire when he heard something, soft, almost lost beneath the wind. A noise that didn't belong to the storm outside. A faint whimper. Frowning, he set his book aside and approached the window. The glass was fogged from the warmth of the house, but as he peered out, he expected to see nothing more than a raccoon scavenging or a fox passing through. Instead, he met a pair of pleading, sorrowful eyes. The sight made his breath hitch. A dog. No, a starving, beaten thing, her ribs pressing against her skin, her fur matted with ice. And at her feet, a motionless pup. John didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, his boots heavy on the wooden floor as he reached the door. When he pulled it open, a rush of warm air spilled out, casting golden light onto the snow-covered porch. The mother dog flinched. She crouched low, her body stiff, her ears flattening against her skull. Instinct screamed at her to run. The last time a door had swung open toward her, it had been followed by a boot, by shouting, by pain. But this time, there was no anger. No violence. Just warmth. John knelt, his breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. His sharp eyes scanned the mother dog, taking in her wounds, the exhaustion in every inch of her. Then he looked down at the pup. He wasn't moving. John reached out carefully, his fingers brushing against the tiny body. He expected the mother to snap, to growl, to bare her teeth in desperation. She didn't. She just let out a sound, low and broken, barely a whimper. A plea. Help him. John's throat tightened. Carefully, he scooped up the pup, cradling him against his chest. The little thing was cold, too cold. His heartbeat was faint, his breath barely a whisper against John's skin. "This one's not done fighting yet," John murmured, his voice rough but gentle. He looked at the mother again. She didn't move, didn't run, didn't fight. She just stood there, swaying slightly, her entire body trembling. John made his choice. "Come inside," he said, stepping back, holding the door open. For a moment, the mother dog hesitated. Then she followed. The door creaked as John pushed it open, the warmth of the cabin spilling into the frozen night. He expected the mother dog to hesitate, to back away in fear, but she did not move. She stood stiffly, her breath shallow, her body shaking from exhaustion and cold. Snow clung to her fur, and frost crusted the edges of her ears, but she didn't care about herself. Her eyes, hollow with hunger and desperation, were fixed on the tiny bundle in John's hands. She stepped forward. Her paws, stiff with ice, pressed against the threshold of the cabin. The heat inside hit her like a wave, unfamiliar and almost suffocating after so many nights spent in the frozen wilderness. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and flee, to run back into the shadows where she belonged, where humans could not touch her, could not hurt her. But her pup lay limp in the man's hands, his body cold and unmoving. She could not leave. John stepped back, giving her space, his sharp eyes never leaving her. She was on the brink of collapse, her ribs pressing through her thin coat, her legs trembling. He had seen animals in bad shape before, but this was different. He knelt by the fire and gently laid the pup on a thick wool blanket. His hands moved quickly, with practiced care, as he wrapped the tiny body, swaddling it in warmth. The mother dog crept forward, her movements slow, unsure. She stopped only a few feet away, her body hunched low, her tail tucked between her legs. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But she didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She only watched, her golden brown eyes locked onto his hands, her silent question clear. "Will you save my child?" John felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached for a small wooden bowl, his fingers steady as he crushed dried herbs, mixing them into a warm broth. He had used this remedy before, on animals, on people. It would help bring warmth back to the pup's tiny body, coax his lungs to keep working. He scooped up a spoonful and pressed it to the pup's lips. Nothing. The little body did not react. John's jaw tightened. He dipped his fingers into the warm liquid and carefully rubbed it along the pup's gums, hoping the heat would reach him. The mother let out a soft whine, her body pressing closer, but she did not touch him. She was waiting, watching, willing herself to believe this human would not fail her. Minutes passed. The fire crackled, filling the silence with its soft, steady hum. The warmth seeped into the pup's tiny frame, chasing away the deathly cold. John rubbed his fingers gently over the pup's ribs, willing his tiny lungs to keep working. A twitch. A weak, barely there movement. The mother dog sucked in a breath. John's hand stilled. He watched as the pup's tiny mouth parted just slightly, a faint whimper escaping. It was weak, fragile, but it was there. The mother let out a low, trembling whine, stepping forward, her nose brushing against her pup's face. Her body sagged with relief, but she did not take her eyes off John. Not yet. John exhaled slowly, carefully scooping another spoonful of the herbal broth. He pressed it gently against the pup's lips again. This time, the tiny mouth moved. The pup swallowed. It was slow. But it was enough. The mother dog's tail gave the smallest, barely visible twitch. John felt a knot in his chest loosen. He glanced up at her, his voice low and steady. "He's fighting." The mother dog did not understand his words, but she understood his tone. She sank down onto the floor, pressing her body close to her pup's side, her nose buried in his fur. The fear was still there, lingering in her hollow ribs and wary eyes, but for the first time in a long, long time, hope flickered inside her. The wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin, but inside, warmth wrapped around the small space like a protective cocoon. The fire flickered steadily in the hearth, its orange glow casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The smell of herbs, wood smoke, and simmering broth filled the air. On the thick wool blanket near the fire, the tiny pup lay curled, no longer limp and lifeless but breathing, slow, steady, warm. His fur was no longer crusted with frost, no longer stiff with the icy grip of death. His tiny ribs no longer strained with each breath. The first night had been the hardest. His body had fought against the cold's lingering grasp, shaking uncontrollably as warmth seeped into him. John had stayed awake, keeping watch, rubbing the pup's frail body with careful hands, feeding him drop by drop with warm broth until his weak whimpers turned into tiny, restless movements. The mother dog had never moved from her spot. She had watched every second, her gaunt frame hunched near the door, too weak to pace, too afraid to rest. She had refused to come closer, but her eyes never left John's hands, following each motion, each breath, each stir of the blanket. By morning, the pup had twitched in his sleep. By the next night, he had nuzzled weakly against the fabric, seeking warmth. And now days had passed. The pup was moving more. First, barely shifting, his tiny paws pressing into the blanket, his head wobbling weakly as he tried to lift it. Then little stretches, tiny kicks, proof that life still clung to him, that the fight had not been in vain. John had seen it before in injured animals. The slow return, the stubborn pull of survival. But this was different. This was something else. The mother dog never left the porch. John had tried to coax her inside, offering food, warmth, even the blanket from the fire. But she would not move past the doorframe. She remained on the cold wooden boards, curled tightly against herself, her eyes locked on the pup. She refused to eat unless John left the food outside. She refused to drink unless the bowl was placed where she could reach it without stepping too far into the house. She would not cross the threshold, no matter how bitter the wind grew. She did not trust him. Not yet. But she trusted him enough to let him help. And that was enough. John didn't push her. He simply worked, tending to the pup, watching as his frail body strengthened, as his breathing steadied. He spoke to him in low murmurs, letting the little thing hear his voice, letting him know he was safe. Each day, the tiny movements became stronger. The pup's head no longer wobbled when he lifted it. His paws no longer twitched weakly but stretched with purpose, pressing against the blanket, testing their strength. Then the moment came. John had been stirring the fire when he heard it, a small, uncertain rustling behind him. He turned, expecting to see the pup shifting in his sleep. But instead he saw him, standing. His legs trembled, his tiny frame swaying, but he was up. His ears twitched forward, his nose sniffing the air. And then, his tail, thin and frail, gave a tiny wag. A sound split the air. A bark. But a bark. Before John could react, a blur of motion shot past him. The mother dog. She had moved faster than he had ever seen, darting past the doorframe without hesitation, her thin body streaking across the wooden floor. She was at her pup's side in an instant, her nose pressing into his fur, her tongue frantically licking his face. She whined, a sound full of relief, of something breaking loose inside her, something desperate and raw. The pup yipped, startled by her sudden burst of energy, but he didn't pull away. He wobbled, his small paws pressing against the blanket, his tail wagging faster. He licked back, his tiny tongue barely reaching her nose. John exhaled, his chest tightening in a way he hadn't expected. The mother was crying. Not in the way humans did, but in the way only a mother who had come too close to losing everything could. She whined and licked, pressing her forehead against her pup's, curling around him in a way that shielded him from everything. John watched, his hands resting against his knees. He knew better than to interrupt. She had waited too long for this moment. She had fought through ice, through starvation, through fear, through every ounce of instinct screaming at her not to trust, just to get here. And now she had won. The pup had survived. She had saved him. John stood, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle her. He knelt beside them, setting down a small bowl of food. The mother dog's eyes flickered to him. She did not growl. She did not flinch. For the first time, she did not look at him like he was something to fear. She just watched. And then, slowly, cautiously, she lowered her head and ate. The days passed in quiet understanding. The mother dog never fully let her guard down, but she no longer hovered near the door, torn between instinct and desperation. She moved freely now, pacing the cabin, following her pup wherever he went. The little one grew stronger with each sunrise, his steps no longer wobbly, his tail no longer hesitant in its wag. His tiny bark echoed through the cabin, a sound of newfound confidence, of life asserting itself against the cold that had once tried to take it. John had seen this before, the slow return of an animal from the brink, the moment when survival was no longer a battle but a certainty. He knew what came next. They would leave. It was inevitable. No matter how warm the fire, how soft the blanket, how safe the walls, wild things were not meant for a home. They belonged to the wind, to the trees, to the untamed world beyond human reach. And this mother, who had risked everything to save her pup, was no exception. She had come only because she had no choice. Now she did. John first noticed the change in the early morning light. The mother stood near the door, her body still, her ears perked, her nose twitching at the scent of the forest beyond. The pup, ever curious, bounded forward, sniffing at the wooden boards as if sensing something was different. They were restless. They were ready. John said nothing. He simply opened the door. The cold morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pines. The mother's ears flicked back for a moment, hesitation flickering in her tired eyes. Then, without a sound, she stepped forward, out into the frost-kissed world. The pup hesitated. He turned to John, his small head tilting, his bright eyes searching. Then, as if understanding something unspoken, he yipped and scampered after his mother. John remained in the doorway, watching as they crossed the clearing. The forest loomed before them, dark and endless, waiting to swallow them whole. Then, just before the tree line, the mother stopped. She turned back. Her golden-brown eyes locked onto John's, something unreadable flickering within them. It was not trust. Not entirely. Not warmth, nor attachment. But it was something. A silent acknowledgement. A thank you. Then, without another glance, she turned and ran. The pup followed, his tiny legs kicking up frost, his high-pitched bark echoing once before fading into the vast, untamed world. John stood there for a long time, the cold biting at his skin, the warmth of the cabin at his back. A small, tired smile touched his lips. Then he closed the door.